Introduction to Cornelius Castoriadis, History as Creation, by Maurice Brinton. Quote, all fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. End quote. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848. These words are even truer today than when they were written 130 years ago. In the 19th century, the idea of progress was self-evident. The body of scientific knowledge grew and rapidly became incorporated into the fabric of expanding capitalism. In the 1890s, some physicists even predicted that all there was to know about the universe would soon be within their grasp. The figure of 20 years has bandied about. Great, quote, unifying, end quote, theories were being thrown up. Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, the universal theory of gravitation, Mendeleev's periodic table of elements, Darwin's theory of the origin of species through natural selection. The great intellectual edifice of 19th century science was an imposing counterpoint to the remorseless surge of the Industrial Revolution, which during this period was changing the face of Europe. Technology seemed omnipotent. The bourgeoisie had dethroned God and instituted the realm of reason. It believed that everything was inherently rational, determinable, quantifiable. It had to be in order to be bought and sold. This was the science that the founders of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, had sucked into their bones. The science of elegant universalism, of cosmological laws to which there were no exceptions, of systems that would encompass the whole reality in their net. The very structure of this kind of thinking reflected the confident ambitions of a capitalism in full development. In the air was the promise that life itself would soon be amenable to the same mathematical manipulations that had successfully predicted the motion of the stars, the combination of atoms, and the propagation of light. It is scarcely surprising that, as an offshoot or extension of bourgeois objectivist rationalism, a grand theory of history and social change, namely Marxism, was to emerge, based on the methodological premises and impregnated with the scientific euphoria of the 19th century. The particular setting, quote, provided both the bricks and mortar for such a theory, largely predetermining even what were to be its dominant categories, end quote. The economy seemed the obvious basis of all social relations and was solely theorized as such. The techniques of capitalist production were consecrated as scientifically inevitable, although criticism was levied at how the product was distributed. Capitalist models of organization and efficiency were imported into the radical movement. Under the guise of revolutionary theory, an ideology was born that was to develop, the ideology of a bureaucracy whose ascendancy was still in the future. Bourgeois historians were by no means immune from this movement. They started asserting that their subject was, quote, a science no less and no more, end quote, and as such, the bourgeois historians were necessarily obliged to meet the, quote, scientific demand for completeness and certainty, end quote. As E.P. Cheney succinctly put it, quote, history, the great course of human affairs, has been the result not of voluntary action on the part of individuals or groups of individuals, much less of chance, but has been subject to law, end quote. The task of the historian was no longer even to attempt to discover, quote, what actually happened, end quote, but rather to discover those laws. Science, however, did not stop in the 19th century. Since the turn of the century, science has undergone a series of major revolutions. Its texture and content are radically different today from what they were a few decades ago. The uncertainty principle seems here to stay. The effects of the observer on the, quote, thing, end quote, observed are noted in field after field. The interreactions of systems are now a topic for study rather than predictions concerning the position or behavior of the individual components. The non-hierarchical units of ecological systems are more relevant to us today than studies of linear progressions leading from simple to more complex unicellular organisms. From these to multicellular forms of life, and from the latter, right, quote, up, unquote, to the summits of biological evolution inhabited by humankind. Scientific insights today both reflect deep changes in prevailing philosophy and help further to deepen them. Apart, it would appear from revolutionary theory, everything today is up for re-examination. Additional knowledge is no longer automatically equated with progress. Footnote. The debate about genetic engineering is a case in point. Some scientists talk of voluntary self-censorship by the scientific community. A Nobel Prize winner can now write, quote, I fear for the future of science as we have known it, for humankind, for life on Earth. The new technology excites me, yet the price is high, perhaps too high. George Wald, The Sciences. End footnote. Scientists are increasingly questioning the methods and structure of science, its rigid separation of the subjective from the objective, its equation of technology with advance, not to mention the way it misuses knowledge. The advocates of, quote, scientific, end quote, socialism spare themselves these doubts. They ignore this process of self-questioning. The, quote, science, end quote, of their, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, seems immune from the crisis of science as a whole. Many such people start striving to change the course of history only after becoming convinced that the direction of history is independent of their will. They see history as a train running along a track, an analogy drawn, oh so tellingly and revealingly, from the Industrial Revolution. Some would prefer a, quote, freer, end quote, metaphor, perhaps that of a torrent, at times a flood, at times a trickle, earthbound certainly by the laws of gravity, but within those limits able to circumvent or remove obstacles, and certainly capable, when necessary, of shaping its own bed and even changing it. But this metaphor, too, basing itself as it does on the phenomena of natural science, bears the imprint and has all the limitations of a period. Objections to Marxism at a coherently argued level usually come from two main sources, from downright reactionaries defending the existing order, or from the methodological nitpickers of the academic establishment, more concerned with point scoring or with public display of their erudition than with a genuine understanding of the world around them. It is rare today to find a philosophical critique of Marx coming from those who, like him, seek radically to transform society. A thought-out critique that is both libertarian and revolutionary, and that moreover identifies Marxism as a useful philosophy for the bureaucracy, is rarer still. The need for such an approach is now obvious. Revolutionaries must challenge the dominant ideology in whatever guise it may present itself. If Marxism now provides the philosophical cornerstone of the new hierarchical and exploitative regimes, it is a relevant target for us. Philosophical ideas and assumptions are as much part of what holds these new societies together as are institutional violence, policemen, and ultimately the armed forces of the state. A challenge of this kind is a legitimate endeavor. The seeds of new social orders always sprout as philosophical assumptions long before the revolution. The revolutionary bureaucrat, incidentally, also appears before the revolution. Philosophical ideas contribute to the intellectual climate which helps shape societies. The Enlightenment preceded the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie won its philosophical battle against the aristocracy and the clergy long before it secured its own political ascendancy. Bourgeois society is today in crisis. In the wings are the Marxists, the ideologues of the bureaucracy. Marxist assumptions today permeate the thinking of those who see themselves as the midwives of new societies. There are plenty of examples of what these assumptions are tending to produce and have in fact already produced. We refuse to believe that these creations are all, quote, historical accidents, end quote. No society can be that accident-prone. Our century is littered with, quote, revolutions, end quote, which gave birth to authoritarian and repressive regimes, officially upholding Marx's ideas, even teaching them in schools and universities. These regimes are obsessed with such notions as, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, and the, quote, unfettered development of the productive forces, end quote. Many have by and large achieved such demands of the Communist Manifesto of 1848 as the, quote, centralization of credit, end quote, or, quote, the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, end quote. Quote, the extension of factories and instruments of production, end quote, owned by the same state, is nowadays taken for granted by all, quote, progressive, end quote, regimes. But the future is not settled. The Libertarian Revolution is not a utopian project. In this perspective, the unseating of authority, especially of so-called, quote, revolutionary, end quote, authority, is an act of liberation. For objectivist rationalism applied to history is tantamount to purging history of all that is creative and alive, and therefore unpredictable within it. Genuine creation is the act of producing that which is not totally implicit in the previous state of affairs. Such creations play a major role in history. By its very nature, it defies the dictates of predetermination. For those who see history as the unfurling of a dialectical process, which leads inevitably, quote, forward, end quote, towards a particular brand of, quote, socialism, end quote, or which grants history or as sole alternative the right to stagnate in capitalist barbarism, there is no real history. There are just mechanisms. There is no more history in such an outlook than there is in a chemical reaction, however explosive, produced by mixing ingredients of known composition with known properties in the appropriate proportions and in the right sequence. What areas of choice does history offer us? If there are none, are we merely acting out a drama scripted by him, her, it, or they? Whether the agency be the bearded god of the Christians, the imageless god of the Judeo-Muslims, the mother goddess of the early civilizations, Hegel's logos, or the unfurling of the materialist dialectic, leading to the inevitable emergence of the communist humanity, matters little in this respect. Can rationalism, quote, the ratio of all we have already known, end quote, as Blake once put it, fully forecast the creations we have yet to make? If it can, there is nothing original in anything we do. If it cannot, then the power of rationalism has certain inherent limitations. If a, quote, scientific, end quote, theory of history can predict history, there is no such thing as a genuine choice. If it cannot, then, quote, scientific, end quote, interpretations of the past are subject to the same limitations as similar predictions of the future. Castoriadis' critique of, quote, rationalism, end quote, does not throw reason out of the window. Castoriadis' critique of rationalism merely challenges rationalism's omnipotence and seeks to define rationalism's limits. Nor does Castoriadis' critique of objectivism deny that phenomena exist independently of the human mind. It merely stresses that the human mind molds what the human mind perceives, endowing what the human mind perceives with signification. At the level of natural phenomenon, new interpretations lead to new exploration. At the level of social phenomenon, the human mind shapes new attitudes, new roles, and eventually new institutions. The critique of what Marx himself, in the German ideology, was to call the, quote, tyranny of concepts, end quote, is deeply subversive. The struggle against, quote, all that is, end quote, now forces revolutionaries to rethink issues long considered, quote, settled, end quote, rescuing in the process the term, quote, praxis, end quote, creative and self-transforming activity, from its widespread confusion with, quote, practice, end quote. the application of rationality to concrete tasks. Against this background, it is not really surprising that the philosophical ideas of Karl Marx should be deemed ripe for re-examination. The critique of fixed, fast, frozen relations is, after all, only an aspect of the intellectual climate of our time. End quote. Solidarity, Pamphlet 54, July 1978.